in the cities. He was in the military and he served in the war in Afghanistan back in the early 2000s. And during one particular battle, Richard lost his left arm. And over the course of the next 6 months, he was really depressed. He lost his self-confidence. They weren't able to reattach it properly, and so he literally didn't have the use of his left arm. And one day when he was at work, Richard was talking to his friend, and his friend said, "Listen, Richard, I see that you're down. I see you're depressed. You got to snap out of it. And what I want you to do, I want you to think about joining judo." And Richard said, "What's judo?" He said, well, judo is a martial art, and it requires throws, and it requires submission holds and things like that. And Richard said, "Have you seen me? I don't have a left arm. How in the world would I possibly compete against these guys?" He said, "Listen, Richard, I understand where you're coming from, but I want you to go down to the judo class and check it out. There's a sensei there. He's a master of judo, and he could teach you all about judo." And so Richard did, and he went down, and he started learning more about what it would take to be in judo. He talked to the master, the sensei, and he said, the sensei said, "Listen, Richard, I know you're considering going out for judo, but before you do, I want you to promise me 3 things. First, I want you to promise me that you'll never give up. I want you to promise that you'll always do your best, and I want you to promise, Richard, that you'll do whatever I ask you to do. Can you promise me those things?" And Richard thought to himself, and he said, "Yeah, I can commit to that." So he did. And over the course of the next 6 months, he practiced 6 days a week. He'd always be at judo class. He kept learning the moves. And the one move that his judo master taught him was a move how he would take his opponent's hand and peel him away from his body. And he would step up underneath his opponent's weight, and he'd push his opponent away. And what he would do when his opponent would come at him is he would step underneath his armpit, pick him up, use his leverage, and throw him on the ground. And he'd pin him. And he just kept working on that move over and over and over again. And after about 6 months, his sensei came to him and said, "Richard, listen, you've practiced that move. You've done a great job. You've been dedicated. I want you to enter a tournament." And all those fears and all that insecurity and all the doubts, all the self-doubt crept back into his mind. And he said, "No, Sensei, I can't do that. If I go to a tournament, they'll all laugh at me. I'll get throttled, and they'll all laugh at me." And the sensei said, "Listen, Richard, when you join judo, you promised me 3 things. First, you promised me never give up. You also promised me do your best. And third, you promised me do whatever I ask. And Richard, I'm asking you to enter this tournament." Richard thought about it and realized the sensei was right, and so he did. He entered the tournament. It was down in the Excel Center down in St. Paul. About 1,500 people there. Went to his first match, and what do you know? The guy came at Richard, threw him on the mat, and started pounding him. And all those feelings of self-doubt and depression crept back into Richard's mind. And then he remembered. He remembered what his sensei had taught him. About how to peel a man's hands back away from his chest, how to step up underneath his weight and push his opponent away. When that guy came at Richard again, he stepped up underneath his armpit, picked him up, used his leverage, threw him on the mat, and pinned him. And the same thing happened for the next 4 matches until eventually Richard advanced to the championship of his weight bracket. He was kind of feeling good, he couldn't believe that he had made it. And then his sensei came to him and said, "Richard, that's the guy you're competing against in the championship." Richard said, "What? He's not in my weight class." This guy was huge. He looked way bigger than Richard, but he was in his weight class. He said, "Yeah, you got to compete against that guy." And Richard said, "No way, Sensei. In no way am I doing that." And his sensei reminded him of the 3 things that he had promised that he would do. And Richard remembered, and so he obeyed. And he went to that championship match, and that guy came at Richard and just started throttling him. Threw him all over the mat, almost had him in a couple of submission holds twice. And while he was sitting there on the mat face down, he remembered all the times in practice what his sensei had taught him about how to peel a man's hands away, how to step up underneath his weight, how to push him away from him. And when that big dude came at Richard again, Richard stepped up underneath his arm, used his leverage, picked him up on the mat, threw him down, and pinned him. And the crowd went completely nuts. People on their feet cheering. His mom was there. His mom was crying. It was just this huge moment. Richard went over, and he was wiping tears off, and he got crowned with, not crowned, but he got the medal for winning. And he went over to his sensei afterwards, and he said, "Sensei, how did you know that I could do that? How did you know that I could beat that guy?" And his sensei said, "Richard, listen, there's a couple things that I want you to know here. First, that move that you do, the one where you pick the guy up underneath his arm, that's nearly flawless. You've almost perfected it because you've practiced it so much. The second thing that you don't know, Richard, is that the only counter for that move is to grab your opponent's left arm." Richard didn't have a left arm, did he?